determined that we're going to be working in Photoshop, which is resolution dependent, which means you're going to set the resolution and set the size of your file when you start, and that you won't be able to blow it up any further. Let's talk about working with a master file, and then that you will then create final output that's compressed. Now, you didn't know it, but you've already done this in your last project. Your master file was that Illustrator file that I made you send me that ended in .ai. And then you created a compressed output when you posted it on Slack as a JPEG. So you've already done this once, but now I want you to be more aware of what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing. So in this case, we're going to be working in Photoshop, and there are a number of file formats that you can work in. And there are even more that you can convert into. So it's important to work in a file format that will be compatible, that allows you to do everything you want to do, and that you need to do in this case, that is a file that's a reasonable size. That's important too. And that you'll be able to use for archival purposes. So again, you want to make sure that you're working at a high resolution that you can use for whatever you may need to use that file for, and that you don't then find yourself stuck because you can't blow it up. So you're going to want to work in a file that's lossless. So again, when you save, you don't want it dumping data. You don't want it to look like that photograph of the flower that got all blurry. So you want to make sure that when you're done, the file looks as good as when you started. So we're going to talk about the file formats that are lossless that you can work in inside of Photoshop, and why I'm going to ask you to make a Photoshop document, and then when you are going to be creating your elements that you would be either sending to a printer or that you would be putting online, that you'll need to submit them as a different kind of file. So those would be you're exporting or saving a version for a client, either for review, and sometimes you'll need to show your client your process work, and again, clients often don't have Photoshop, or your final deliverable, such as that image that the client wants to put up on Facebook without having to do anything on their end because they paid you. So remember that you want to work in your master file, but you need to give it to your client in a way that they can work with straight off the bat. So when we are exporting for our clients, oftentimes we're going to give them a file that's compressed. Again, they don't have Photoshop, they're using it for a specific purpose, and so we're going to go ahead and compress it for them in a way that looks good, but suits their purposes. So that's often what's called a lossy format, or a format that loses some data. But we know what they're using it for, so we give it to them in a way that's optimized for their use. So the way that we do this compression is that the computer kind of has a set of rules that it's going to apply, called an algorithm, to your image. And it decides what data it's going to keep and what data it's going to throw away. And each file format applies this differently. And some of them are optimized for screen, some of them for print. So again, we need to understand what each one is good for. Now, when the computer does this, the thing that you need to remember, the reason you want to work in a master format, is because when you're compressing that into a file that, for example, JPEG, every time you save a JPEG, you lose more data. It'll actually get smaller if you save it enough times. So remembering that when you are working in something, you're going to be saving it a lot. Remember, save early and often. You don't want your computer to crash or you to lose connection and suddenly you've lost hours worth of work. I want to save you from the heartache and headaches I've been through myself. I've personally had this happen. So if you're saving constantly, you don't want to be losing data constantly, because in the end, your file won't look as good as when it started. So again, you want to work in a format that is lossless. Again, not all compression is bad, but a lot of it's lossy. So that's why I'm going to talk about lossless compression and lossy compression. And lossy means that you lose data, lossless, you don't lose it. So again, make yourself a master. Make that master something where you know you're not going to lose your data along the way. And try not to, if you do save something in a file format that is lossy, don't use that file to make new files. Go back to your original. Go back to that master in order to make different copies and different versions so that you don't compound data loss. It's like a really bad loan. So loss less compression, like a zip file. You do manage to have a smaller file. It manages to rearrange the data in such a way it takes up less space, but it doesn't throw anything out. And that's the important part. It's like someone who can pack a U-Haul truck really well. I'm not good at it, my husband is. We could take the same amount of stuff and he could fit it in a smaller U-Haul than I could. He's good at lossless compression. So in this case, you can perfectly reconstruct all of the elements. Nothing is thrown out along the way, but some of them, in order to fit it in your small U-Haul truck, I'd fill a trash bag. You don't want to be me. So the reason you don't want to throw things out is it's exactly like that image I showed you earlier of the flowers and the ferns, where that fern, when I went to go back to the original size, the size that I took it in, because it threw away all that data, it looked fuzzy when I blew it back up. You don't want your images to look like that. It looks amateurish. It just looks plain bad. So do not, when possible, do not discard data, because you never know if you might need it later. So make sure that you try not to have irreversible compression and data loss unless you know that that is the last place it's going. I know I'm not moving ever again and I'm never going to need this table ever again. I can throw it out. But it's probably better to have my husband pack the U-Haul and save the table, because I probably will end up needing it. That's my terrible metaphor for a lossless data compression. But basically, it's the same kind of deal when you're looking at that image of the flowers. I thought, oh great, I'm going to use it as a Twitter banner. I'm only going to need it 1,000 pixels wide. I threw out all that data, and then I found out that actually someone really liked it and wants to order a print of it, and in order to print it out nicely, I need those pixels back. I can't get them back, and it's not going to look good, and they're going to be really disappointed. So lossy methods often get applied to photos because, especially on screen, we can kind of get away with losing a certain amount of data and our naked eye won't pick it up. So the most common lossy image format is a JPEG, and they're great for on-screen. JPEGs are absolutely wonderful for screen use because the fact that we don't perceive a lot of the data loss. So we'll sometimes call that visually lossless because we can't perceive the difference. Again, it's kind of like when you're sitting with your friend who's an audiophile and you've both bought an album on Bandcamp, and I download the MP3 and he downloads the FLAC file. I can't tell the difference in quality, but he can. Same thing with the JPEG versus the original. If you're seeing it on screen, then most of the time you can't visually tell the difference. Problem gets when you go to print, so we'll get to that in a second. But visually on screen, oftentimes you can't tell the difference, which is why we use it so much. But when you're making your own, you want to make sure that you don't lose any of it, because you never know what you're going to need it for later. So we're going to be working our master files as Photoshop documents, PSDs, it's the equivalent of that AI. But you may also come across TIFFs and RAW files. So I just want to kind of briefly touch on those as well, just so that you understand what they are and why we're going to talk about them. Now I'm going to go into the details of all these files in a second, but I'm going to do that as another video, so I'm going to pick back up here in a minute.